say thank you for being here. Today I'm very honored to introduce our very special guest. And I have some slides for that to be more official. So, Professor Bruce Lawrence is Nancy and Jeffrey Marcuse, Humanities, Distinguished Professor, Emeritus of Religion. I would say everything about Professor Lawrence is great, except that he has been at Duke University since 1971. How many years did he? 1971? 50 years at Duke. Not full, I think. As you likely know, we are not that happy about about Duke. As you can see, there was some incident recently. Some trolls and things like that. So, also to make sure that we have got the right person, I wanted to make sure that we check the image. It seems right to me. If it is okay with you guys, I think we got the right person. Professor Ernst earned his doctorate degree at Yale University.
Professor Ernst. No, that's my colleague.
Did I say Professor Ernst?
I think I heard.
No! Did I say? Sorry, a slip of tongue.
We're close, but not that close.
Slip of tongue, okay. Professor Lawrence earned his doctorate at Yale University in History of Religion. What is the plan today? I have dedicated about 45 minutes to my introduction and 10 good minutes for him to talk. And that was not a joke. So. I tried to look up his list of publications. First, I realized that they started in 1976 and steadily went all the way to 2020. It means 40 years of writing. No complaints about one semester of writing, okay? Again, not a joke. Second, due to the daunting breadth of Professor Lawrence's publication, it was impossible to make a list, so I didn't make a list. Yet, there was an interesting outcome of me looking up, and that is, I developed a chronic depression syndrome. As I realized, it is impossible for a person with my mediocre talent and sheer dedication to even fantasize such level of achievement, let alone realizing it. As you can see in my fantasized day-to-day feelings. Just to read one of, I tried to put some of the publications that I thought were more important to what we are talking about. And I will just read one of the reviews on Defenders of God. Quote, a mature work of comparative religion that few scholars have either the breadth or the theoretical skill to accomplish. A tour de force, end quote. What is remarkable is the currency, the relevance of Professor Lawrence's work for our time, as evident in his public lectures. Talking about Bin Laden to the US Naval Academy to asking, is God a cyberspace? I don't know what does that mean.
She is.
Okay. What is fascinating about his scholarship is not merely its breadth, that is, its astonishing range of topics that it masters. Rather, what makes his work an indispensable contribution to many fields of inquiry is his theoretical rigor, I believe. Many scholars have elaborated on this or that form of fundamentalism, yet the question has remained unanswered. Why this content has assumed that particular form? Put differently, instead of simply accepting fundamentalism as a religious phenomenon, Professor Lawrence turns to ideology, demarcating the line between religion and ideology, or religion as ideology. As we have struggling with the paper. If all of this was not enough, I can add that Professor Lawrence has been the recipient of numerous fellowships, including 2 Guggenheim Awards, a Pew Charitable Trust grant, and Rockefeller Foundation Residency Program grant. I'm truly grateful to you for accepting this invitation. We have an astonishingly talented group of students, which I'm very proud of working with, and we are very excited to learn from you. Please join me welcoming Professor Lawrence.
Well, I should say this, my only disappointment is that I only got to hear the 5-minute, not the 40-minute. I think I'd rather hear your 40 minutes and keep my own remarks to 5 minutes. So, I am a product of Duke, but I want to say something very quickly before you go thinking that I'm only one color blue, even though Defenders of God has a dark Duke blue on, not the light blue Carolina. So back in 30 years before any of you other than maybe Ehsan was born, there was a position opening up in Islamic studies at a university which you're familiar, UNC, and they asked me to apply. And I said, why would I do that? And they said, oh, I know, UNC isn't the same as Duke. I said, no, it's not, it's better. They said, well, why do you say that? And I said, because I've been co-teaching there for 20 years. They said, we didn't know that, how are you doing? I said, it's for the history department. So before, I'll tell you the outcome of that conversation from 1990, but for the first almost 20 years that I was at Duke, I recognized that there was not many connections other than animosity and rivalry and bad blood between the two universities. So I found a friend of mine who was in the history department named Herb Bodman, and I said, why don't we do a course together? And he said, my students would never want to come to Durham. I said, but all mine would love to go to Chapel Hill. He says, you're right, it's a much better place for students to come, especially if they like classes after class at night. So anyway, we wound up doing it, and a few of the Carolina students came over to Durham, and all the Duke students came over to Chapel Hill. And we did that course for a number of years, and it got actually quite a bit of excitement of people saying, oh, you really can collaborate. And eventually, as you know, they originated a bus service that goes between Duke and UNC. My only problem and regret is it didn't happen 30 years earlier. Because it's great to be able to go between the two universities without having to find parking space either there or here. But back to 1990, before I get into fundamentalism, they asked me to apply for the position at Duke, at UNC, and I said, no. They said, because you're at Duke. I said, no, it's not that. I said, I want to have somebody in my own department. I have somebody in history with whom I've been teaching, and he's a great scholar and all that, but he's a historian. I want somebody who's in religion and religious studies. And they said, well, give us a few names. So I gave them a few names, and one of those names was Carl Ernst. So I'm very happy to say that in a small way, I'm responsible for you having a great program here for Ehsan being here today. Forgive all that basketball talk. There really are certain ways in which I think UNC and Duke could and should and even do cooperate. And my friendship, in fact, when people say to me, who's your closest colleague? I say, he's not at Duke, he's at UNC, it's Carl Ernst. True. So, here we are, and here I am talking about Defenders of God. Well, this was not a book I intended to write, just as I never really imagined that somehow I would be here lecturing in class in 2020 on a book that I wrote 30 years ago. But the reason why it came up is because I had for a number of years been working on pre-modern Islamic topics, especially those that relate to the subcontinent, to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, but also Afghanistan and Iran. And then the Iranian Revolution happened, and because I had spent time in India and because Persian was one of the languages in which I worked, everyone thought I could be an expert on what was called Islamic fundamentalism. When Khomeini came to power in 1979, everyone said, oh, this is the beginning of something called Islamic fundamentalism. So as I said to Ehsan, I'm actually going to need a little water to get through this.
Yeah, sure.
I just realized that you and I had some tea, but I didn't take any water. So while he's out of the room, let me tell you all about it. No. Let me just say that he understands also what I mean when I say the Islamic Revolution in 1979 in Iran changed things. First of all, it changed because I, in my own academic career, planned to be in Iran in the fall of '79. As things had turned out, I had an invitation, I had a fellowship, I had leave from Duke. I was going to spend a year, 1979-80, in Tehran at what was then called the Imperial Iranian Academy of Philosophy. And I got a note in the spring saying, due to unforeseen circumstances, we have to cancel your invitation, and by the way, it's not even safe for you to travel here, so good luck. And so I never went to Iran. And then the whole sequel of the American hostage crisis, which I'm sure you've heard about, and the dramatic continuation of, first of all, the Iranian Revolution, but then the Iran-Iraq War, which went on for a whole decade and took millions of lives. All this made Iran very much in the headlines, and when people were struggling to understand it, they came up with the term Islamic fundamentalism. Not Islamic extremism, not Islamic terrorism, although that came up later, but Islamic fundamentalism. So initially I said, no, fundamentalism is a Protestant thing, it's a Christian thing, it's a homegrown variant of some kind of bewildered Christianity that's called fundamentalism, it's not Islamic. And I think I look back on my records, I did it consistently for almost 5 years, from like 1979-80 to 1985. I said there is no such thing as Islamic fundamentalism. And then somebody convinced me that instead of taking it for granted that it's not, I should adapt the term and say, what is it that could be called Islamic fundamentalism? What is it that looks like fundamentalism if it had an Islamic name? And so I did a lot of work and realized that one could stretch the term, but in order to make sure that it wasn't just Islamic and or Christian, I also said, what about Jewish fundamentalism? Is it and Hindu and Muslim and Buddhist and Sikh? And so if you begin to think of it as a category rather than as simply a single item defined by and limited to one community, it has a broader possibility. So that really began in 1985, and this book wasn't finished until 1989. So it took me another 4 years to work through 5 years of denial, 4 years of rethinking and rewriting. And I think what I want to do, because I know from Ehsan that you've read, because he says he gives you quizzes to make sure that you've read everything that you've been assigned. So I know you've had to read 100 and 101. If you haven't read it, let me just tell you, I won't say skip the rest, but if you haven't read this, it's the most important part of what I say. And I'm going to extrapolate from it in telling you a few things about myself and about fundamentalism. So one of the first things I did was to say, this is even before we had Wikipedia. You can't simply go to a dictionary and find a definition of something and say that covers it all. I now found out what Webster says, or All Collegiate says, or the Chicago Style says. And now, of course, we have the internet. You can say, oh, Wikipedia says it's this, and that's it. Those are all called lexical definitions, definitions that are in writing. Lexis means writing, lexical, something that's in writing, usually dictionaries or encyclopedias. I put dictionaries and encyclopedias in the same category. Written definitions that you can go to and say, oh, this is what totalitarianism is, this is what socialism is. Why did I think of socialism? Oh, Bernie won yesterday. You know, just think about all the ways in which you can think about things which you would find online or you find in a dictionary. So that's called lexical. But there's another way of thinking about definitions and thinking about what's called key terms. So I would think of fundamentalism and urge you to think about it. It's, after all, in the title of your course, religion, nationalism, or religion, fundamentalism, nationalism. You could easily have changed the categories, but religion in one sense is the defining first category, and then fundamentalism and nationalism, as you're discovering, and you will continue in the rest of this course and for your papers, that those two categories relate but very unevenly, fundamentalism and nationalism, but both have a certain sense of ideological connection to religion. So the other word that I want to introduce for you, which is in my writing, is ideology. And ideology, for some people, is a bad word because they think it means, again to quote Bernie, socialist or Marxist or something that is really a kind of a leftist version. But there's also totalitarian, authoritarian, rightist ideologies. Ideology can be either far side or one side, or ideology can be mainstream. Liberal ideology is still an ideology. Humanitarian ideology is still an ideology, even though it advocates humanitarian rights for all people. So ideology is different from other categories because it is not always expressed as a category by people who use it. It's implicit in what they do. So religious ideology, a fundamentalist, if we were able to have a group of, and by the way, I've talked to a number of people who are self-defined fundamentalists, and I say, are you also ideologues? And they say, we prefer to just say we're believers. So a fundamentalist would not herself or himself say, of course, I'm an ideologue. But the reason I use the term ideology is it allows one to think about where they cross certain lines. And these definitions that I give here on page 100 and 101 are what fundamentalists have in common as exponents of religious ideology. So the one thing I would like you to get out of my reading, my presence here today, Ehsan's course, is the idea that all three of these categories, religion, fundamentalism, and also nationalism, are ideologies, but that a religious ideology has a particular tone to it because it is not explicit in the way in which nationalism, if you read lots of books of any of your political science majors, lots of things about different forms of nationalism as ideology. So many people think ideology refers only to secular discourse. And what I argue in my book, and I will argue till I'm blue in the face, light blue or dark blue or just plain blue, I would argue that the ideology is consonant with religious as well as with political or national sentiment. So, thank you, Ehsan. So, you know why he's called Ehsan, by the way, before I talk about ideology. Do you know why he's called Ehsan? Okay, because his mother was Muslim, and she liked having a son named Ehsan. But for those of you who aren't Muslim, do you know why Ehsan is a nice name? I'm pointing to you because I assume you're Muslim. You don't know what Ehsan is? So there's a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. You don't know about that? You know who the Prophet Muhammad is. So anyway, there's this, just to show you that there's something beyond ideology about the teacher for your course here. His name is Ehsan, E-H-S-A-N, which is a really strong word. A really strong word. Because there was a hadith, a tradition that was given to the Prophet Muhammad that said there are only three things that really matter. And the first thing that matters is that you surrender yourself to God and to God's will. That's called Islam. But once you surrender, you also have to believe in what you surrender to. So you have to figure out what it all means. That's called Iman. But even after you've surrendered and you figured it out, you have to do something, and the doing of something which really makes it count is Ehsan. So he's in the third place. You may be first or second. He's in the third place. Ehsan, by the way, also means what is best, what is the best, and also the most beautiful. So it's really nice that what's good. You see, he gets one part of that. I won't tell you which part he gets. He gets one part. So everything else I say today will be, less important than what I just said. It's all about family resemblances. So I'm talking about the family resemblance between Ehsan's name and who he is. But here on page 100 and 101 of my book, I say that fundamentalists are five things everywhere. And the first thing is that they're advocates of a pure minority viewpoint against a solely majority. So for instance, one of the religious fundamentalist group I talked about is the moral majority. You say, but they're not a minority, they're a moral majority. But you notice the whole rhetoric of it. They're a moral majority against a secular group that is a minority that denies them their right. So even when you use the language of majority-minority, you're advocating as someone speaking to the others as if they're more powerful and greater than you. So fundamentalists are advocates of a pure minority viewpoint. Even if they are technically, in numerical terms, a majority, they advocate as if they're a minority. And this is certainly true in 1979, when arguably the majority of Muslims, certainly in Iran, were sympathetic to Shiite Islam, but they had not projected themselves as governing. And then even when they governed, they saw themselves as a minority against a group of people who did not fully accept their authority. So fundamentalists always have a minority viewpoint, even when demographically they are the majority. And the second thing about fundamentalists is they are always oppositional. And as I say here, it's one thing to disagree with enemies. I know all of you are going to be active in this current political election cycle, and you might oppose certain people, disagree with certain people, whether you're Democrats or Republicans. Well, if you're Republicans, you can't disagree with Trump. But I mean, if you're Democrats, you can disagree with certain candidates. That wasn't even funny. disagreeing with your enemies is one thing, but actively confronting them and opposing them as evil is something else. And fundamentalists are not just unlike or ill-disposed towards people who they disagree with. They oppose them as enemies who have to be confronted and also removed from power. So they're a minority that's oppositional, that seeks power. But this is the third thing, and this is probably the most controversial element of all the elements I've got. There are 5, but the middle one, the third one, is the most controversial. That fundamentalists are secondary level male elites. And by secondary level, I mean that even if they come from a privileged background, they don't see themselves being in the leadership corps or the uppermost echelon of society. And I'm not talking about money or genealogy. I'm talking about how they view themselves vis-a-vis the political domain which they're concerned with. So they're secondary level, or second tier is another word sometimes used, male elites. And of course the word that gets most attention there is male. And I've been in groups with many people who would self-define as fundamentalists saying, oh, but look at how many women we are here. So there are many women fundamentalists. Why do you say they're male elites? And then I asked the women in the group, so who of you would like to rule? Who want to rule? It's not our position to be the director, our position is to be the follower. So even when they're female, and even a large contingent, and my wife has written a lot about Egyptian Muslim female fundamentalists, and their idea is always, well, we help the men to prevail. So even when you're a female fundamentalist, in let's say in this case a Sunni Muslim Egyptian context, you favor male dominance and male norms in your society. So it's male in the sense that men are in position of powers, but even women who support them as having male privilege that females are denied. And then there is this issue of technical vocabulary. I use this fancy word, the polysemia of language, that is, language can mean many things to many different people. And I use 3 terms, each one of which could be the topic of everything else I say for the next 30 minutes. But I'm not going to, by the way, just so you know, I'm not going to talk for 30 minutes. If I'm still talking by quarter after, Ehsan is going to raise his hand and say it's time for Q&A, but I think I'll be done before that. But I want to get some basic points out and then give you a chance to ask me questions. But the business about technical language, I think, is very important. Halakha is a norm of, is there anybody in this room who is a Jewish fundamentalist? Anybody Jewish? Okay, well then you're
not fundamentalist.
But you know the word halakha.
Yeah.
Halakha. So what would you define that as?
I know the word. I'm not confident enough to define it though.
It's kind of a norm for action. Halakha is norm for action, for what you're supposed to do. A mitzvah, you know that term?
Mm-hmm.
A mitzvah is a good action. And it's a very good thing if you're Jewish to do mitzvot. You have more mitzvot than chalkin against you when you are in judgment. And then for Muslims, it's the word Sharia. And I think at least one person, maybe 2 people in this room have heard the word Sharia before. But Sharia is a governing norm of conduct. It's often translated just as law, but it's a governing norm of conduct. And so halakha for Jews, Sharia for Muslims. And then I put in parenthesis mark creation, because creation is a word that can be used many ways by different people. But when Christian fundamentalists talk about creation, they have bracketed next to it a really deep religious ideology called creationism. And I write about that in a whole chapter in my book, is what is creationism? And by the way, they're also in Islam. And I teach in Turkey now, since I retired from that other place down the road. I've been teaching in Turkey for the last 8 years. And many of my Turkish students say, oh, would you please talk to us about why Harun Yahya is wrong? It doesn't matter who Harun Yahya is, but he is, well, it doesn't matter, I've just introduced him. Harun Yahya is a Turkish Muslim fundamentalist who absolutely believes that creation is every bit as what biblical fundamentalists think it is. That it started 5,000 years ago, that it's marked by separate epochs, that to think that the world has dinosaurs or fossils that go back tens of thousands or millions of years is against creation. It's against creation, but it was created. No, it's against creation as a divine norm. So this word creation in quotation marks. Creation meaning divine creation at a specific time that covers the whole world is something that is really fundamental, literally fundamental to every Christian fundamentalist, Protestant Christian fundamentalist, but it also exists in Muslim fundamentalism. And by the way, there are also some people, the Gush Emanim, who are in the West Bank and Israel, who also have their own form of creationism. So this idea that if you're going to believe in one divine power, and this is what I call religious ideology, it's not enough to say it's in Scripture, it's not enough to say it's in society, it's not enough to say it applies to your group, it applies for the whole world. So creationism is an ideology, a religious ideology that says, unless you believe God created the world in that year, and the whole world, the whole universe, forget about universes beyond the universe we now know, which is increasingly becoming clear that we're only one universe in many universes. I think it was, I forgot the scientist, but I read this about a month ago that said we actually probably only know 2% of all that's in the universe. There's still much, much more to be discovered in outer space than I could have imagined when I was young, or you can imagine now in your time, but your children's children may be exploring universes that are not even named or known now. But for creationism, that's nonsense. Creationism is what happened 5,000 years before Christ and what marches on to now. The last 7,000 years is all there ever was, all there ever will be, all there ever can be. That's creationism. So beyond minority, it's oppositional, it's male governed and male favorable with technical language. The primary thing, and it's where I started out by saying to you that fundamentalism is religious ideology. This is a little bit tricky, and I'm going to read it and then explain it. It's the bottom of 100, the top of 101. Fundamentalism has historical antecedents, but no ideological precursors. You have to think about it. It means there are people who are cited, the Maccabean revolt for Jews, the Protestant Reformation for Christians, the Wahhabi revolt for Sunni Muslims, the martyrdom of Hussein for Shiis. All these are events in the past that are cited by various fundamentalist groups, whether they're Sunni, Shi'i, Protestant, or Jewish. But they are not the basis of the religious ideology. The religious ideology itself is recent. And there's Mark Bloch, a wonderful historian, who says, one should never confuse origins with beginnings. Origin is when something could be said to begin. The Maccabean revolt for Jews, the Reformation for Protestant Christians, Wahhabi for Sunni Muslims, or the death of Hussein for Shi'i Muslims. But those origins are not the same as beginnings. The beginnings are when something actually starts, not when it's cited, but when it begins. So origins are historical, beginnings are present. And so my argument is that fundamentalism as a religious ideology is very recent, so that if you think about it in America, this is the top of 101. It only began at the end of the last century, and I can't tell you, I will tell you, one little funny story. I went to Bob Jones University. Some of you ever heard of that place? Yeah. Down in South Carolina. And I couldn't understand why they had me come. And they said, well, because you wrote the book on fundamentalism, and we want you to come and talk to our students. I want to tell you, I'm not intimidated easily, except by Carl Ernst, and now by Ehsan. But you know, apart from people at UNC who intimidate me, the only other people who really can intimidate me are fundamentalists who call me out as their hero. Because I think I'm actually kind of their critic, or at least I'm a bystander. But here's Bob Jones, and he called me down, and he said, I want you to give a talk to our group. So I walked through Assembly Hall, I kid you not, 4,000 students. And I had big classes at Duke, but I never had 4,000. And I've even given a couple talks at UNC Chapel, and it's maybe 1,200 people, but 4,000. And he said, I want to introduce you to this liberal from Duke, who actually believes that the Bible was revealed to King James. I said, King James? And afterwards I said, what is that? And he said, well, he said, you keep talking about Protestant fundamentalism. And this shows you how blind you can be. Protestant fundamentalism, it's the Bible, the Bible. I always thought the Bible is the Bible. You know, it's Hebrew, it's Greek. You know, you're some of you religious studies students, you know that there are various languages. For Bob Jones, the Bible is the King James Version. It came out not in the year 1000, or you know, if you go back to Jerusalem in 900 BCE, it came out in 1500 under King James in England. And afterwards I said, well, that's really a pretty good joke. He said, no, it's true. He said, I'll take you to our library. And he takes me right out of the auditorium, marches me around to this library at Bob Jones University, BJU they call it, Bob Jones University, BJU. And I go into the BJU library, and there, just wall after wall of copies of the King James